For years ago, China announced comprehensive restrictions on a variety of Australian export products, including barley, wine, lobster, beef, etc. The total value of these products is as high as $12.4 billion US. So it has also caused a huge impact on Australia's export industry. It was not until December this year that China finally sent a major signal to fully resume the trade of live Australian lobsters. This also means that China has lifted trade sanctions on all Australian products. This decision by China also made Australian fishermen feel relieved. In an interview with the media, some fishermen mentioned that he and other colleagues have begun to plan their business plans for next year. He even sighed, seeing that the lobsters we worked so hard to catch can re-enter the Chinese market. I really feel that there is new hope. However, this also makes people wonder, why did China ban the import of these Australian foods? And what did Australia do to prompt China to choose to lift trade restrictions at this point in time? If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now let's get into today's topic. When we go back to 5 years ago, the free trade agreement signed by China and Australia officially came into effect. For a time, more and more Australian goods began to enter the Chinese market with zero tariffs, involving areas such as agriculture, animal husbandry, energy, and mining. At that time, Australia's export dependence on China can be said to be very obvious. About 1/3 of its exports went to China. For example, Western Australia, which is Australia's largest lobster supply area, exported more than 5,500 tons of lobsters to China between 2018 and 2019, with a total value of more than 448 million Australian dollars. That year, the bilateral trade volume between China and Australia set a record of $233.6 billion US, accounting for 27.4% of Australia's global trade, far exceeding the second largest trading partner Japan's $131.9 billion US. However, all this began to change in 2020. At that time, the United States valued Australia's geographical location and abundant resources, and Australia also hoped to enhance its international status by strengthening its strategic relationship with the United States. So the two sides hit it off and joined forces to embark on the road of confronting China. At that time, the Morrison government, the former Australian Prime Minister, also announced that it would invest $168 billion in the next decade to expand its armaments and fully support the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Faced with this situation, in May 2020, China imposed a 5-year anti-dumping duty of up to 73.6% and a countervailing duty of 6.9% on Australian barley on the grounds of anti-dumping, which officially kicked off the sanctions against Australian goods. Since then, many Australian commodities, including coal, beef, timber, and iron, have been rejected by China one after another. In November of the same year, Australian lobsters worth 1.3 million Australian dollars were stranded at Shanghai Pudong Airport due to the suspension of imports. This scene also marked the beginning of Australia's seafood export industry entering a trough. Then in March 2023, China launched the final round of heavy blows on Australian exports, imposing anti-dumping duties of more than 200% on Australian wine. As far as I know, the impact of this economic sanction almost shook the entire Australian trade export, and these restrictions lasted for 4 years. Over the years, everyone thought that Australia's relationship with China was irreparable, until the recent situation seemed to have taken a turn for the better. The Australian government announced that China has lifted import restrictions on Australian lobsters. So, what happened behind this? In fact, the transformation of China-Australia relations began as early as 2022. At that time, Australia ushered in the new Prime Minister Albanese to take office. He took a completely different attitude towards relations with China and actively promoted the full restoration of relations between the two countries. After taking office, He took the initiative to meet with China many times and try to discuss how to repair the political and trade relations between the two sides. It was also at this stage that China successively announced the resumption of imports of some goods from Australia, and the relationship between the two sides began to ease further. Starting in January 2023, Beijing first lifted the import ban on Australian coal. In May, the timber ban was lifted, and in August, the ban on Australian barley was lifted. Until this year, the progress of the two sides easing has accelerated. The wine ban was lifted in March, and restrictions on Australian beef exporters began to be gradually lifted in May. According to a spokesperson for the Australian Meat Industry Association, there are still 2 slaughterhouses under the ban, but they are actively negotiating with China and are expected to reach a solution soon. It was not until December this year that China announced the full resumption of trade in live Australian lobsters. For Australian fishermen, this decision is of great significance because it is the lifting of China's last trade ban on Australia, marking the official end of all China's trade sanctions against Australia. As the largest trading partner in the past decade, China's move made Prime Minister Albanese particularly excited. He immediately announced that trade barriers worth about $12.4 billion facing Australian exports have finally been removed. After receiving the notice from Beijing, the Australian side also immediately stated that lobster exports to mainland China will soon resume. However, upon learning that China had resumed imports of Australian lobsters, the governor of South Australia immediately developed a $30 million seafood export growth plan, with the goal of ensuring that the local seafood industry can fully seize this opportunity once China reissues import licenses. As early as the peak period, the annual export value of lobsters in South Australia was as high as $43 million, and the number of employees engaged in lobster-related industries was conservatively estimated to be more than 1,000. Obviously, this plan is not only about the growth of trade volume, but also directly affects the livelihoods of many families. At the same time, Australian Prime Minister Albanese also pointed out that with the return of Australian commodity exports, including lobsters and barley to the Chinese market, the scale of trade in the future is expected to grow significantly, and even the growth rate in some areas may exceed the level before the ban. So why is Australia so unremittingly showing goodwill to China? In fact, the reason is very simple. The Chinese market is too important for Australia. According to economists' estimates, during the period when China implemented the ban, Australia's export losses of agricultural products such as barley reached as high as $6.2 billion in 1 year. More importantly, exports to China account for 1/10 of Australia's GDP and are also related to about 1/10 of jobs. It can be said that the impact of the Chinese market on the Australian economy cannot be ignored. Take Australia's lobster industry as an example. After being excluded from the lucrative Chinese market, Australian lobster exporters can be said to be struggling. According to data, before the restrictions were implemented, 97.7% of Australia's rock lobster exports went to China, with an annual export volume of more than 1,600 tons. However, since China imposed a ban on Australian lobsters in 2020, Australia has had to find other buyers for 90% of its lobsters for 4 years, which directly led to seafood exporters losing more than $500 million a year. Many Australian fishermen lamented, without the Chinese market, lobsters that used to sell for $70 Australian dollars per kilogram have fallen to $15 Australian dollars at the worst time. The consequences of long-term low prices are obvious. About 50 fishing boats have had to leave his fishing fleet, which means that hundreds of people have left the industry. In order to sell these unsaleable lobsters, fishermen have to work hard to find new markets. But the reality is that alternative markets can never be compared with the Chinese market in the past. In this regard, a local fishery manager said, "For those of them who are highly dependent on the lobster industry, resuming exports now is simply a shot in the arm." Of course, in addition to the lobster industry, Australia's coal industry has also been hit hard by the ban. As we all know, coal, as one of Australia's 3 major export commodities, is the lifeblood of its economy, along with iron, ore, and natural gas. The suddenness of China's ban caught Australian exporters off guard, causing dozens of ships full of coal to be stranded off the coast of China and unable to dock. The entire industry was hit hard as a result. According to statistics, this caused Australia to lose up to $15 billion a year, almost cutting off the contribution of this sector to GDP. In response to this situation, Australian coal producers had to develop new markets such as Southeast Asia and India, while China quickly turned to Indonesia and Russia to buy more coal to fill the gap. However, since China lifted the coal ban in early 2023, Australia's coal exports have rebounded rapidly, and China has returned again and become Australia's largest export destination for coal. There is also Australia's wine industry. After China issued the ban, Australian wine producers lost their largest and most profitable market almost overnight. Before the ban, China's annual imports of wine from Australia accounted for nearly 40% of its total exports, with an annual trade volume of up to 1.24 billion Australian dollars. With the gradual lifting of the ban over the past 6 months, the Australian wine industry has finally received good news. The sales report for April this year was particularly encouraging. The value of South Australian wine exports to China that month was as high as $49.13 million. As exports gradually resume, Australia is full of hope to return to the Chinese market. Australian Prime Minister Albanese revealed in a statement, "Through continued engagement with China, the Australian government has almost eliminated all trade barriers to exports to China." Therefore, from these specific data and the huge contrast after the resumption of exports, we can intuitively feel the importance of the Chinese market to Australia. This also explains why the Albanese government worked so hard to repair its relationship with China after taking office. After all, China is a huge market with a population of 1.4 billion, and the overall consumption level of consumers is in the middle and high end. It is an indispensable core market for the global food industry. Of course, in addition to Australia, even Japan, which ranks fourth in the world in terms of economic output, is no exception. In 2023, Japan carried out 10 rounds of nuclear contaminated water discharge into the sea and discharged a total of about 78,300 tons of nuclear contaminated water. After the implementation of this plan, China announced a comprehensive ban on the import of aquatic products originating from Japan and began to implement the ban since August last year. Now, in order to regain the Chinese market, Japan has finally made some concessions and agreed to China to send experts to the Fukushima discharge site for sampling and monitoring, hoping to gradually restore China's imports of Japanese aquatic products through these measures. You must know that 7 countries, including Russia, South Korea, and China, have previously requested to participate in water pollution detection in Japanese waters, but were rejected by Japan. They have always insisted that only domestic companies can conduct detection. Now, Japan has obviously realized that their aquaculture industry can no longer afford to lose such a huge market as China. However, although China has expressed its willingness to lift the ban, the prerequisite is that Japan must stop discharging nuclear waste water into the ocean. To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.